Hello, my name is Nick Deborah. I'm an independent educator and consultant in the fields of data visualization and dashboard design. And by way of a very brief introduction, I have been doing this kind of work, teaching data visualization and dashboard design for a long time. In the before times, pre-pandemic, I've taught these skills to thousands of professionals just like yourselves. And I have a software background, but really this talk today is not going to be about software. I'm also an author. I have two books that I'm working on, Practical Charts, which will come out in September, and Practical Dashboards, which will come out in 2024. As you can see here, I have a pretty broad variety of clients, public sector, private sector, insurance, pretty much everything all across the board. Today, though, I'd like to talk about a kind of a pretty fundamental question, right? That maybe we don't perhaps think too much about, and I think perhaps we should, which is essentially what makes one chart better than another. And of course, as we all know, people do disagree on this question, right? Whether chart A is better than a chart B, whether certain chart types are better than certain other chart types. And of course, it's always civil, right? We all know that. But I think when people disagree on this question, right, is this chart better or worse than this other chart? They often have very different reasons for believing that one chart is better than another. For example, people will often say that one chart is better than another because it's more precise, that it allows people to visually estimate and compare the values in that chart more precisely than perhaps an alternative design. And in fact, many data visualization studies are based on this idea, right? They measure how precisely people can visually estimate and compare values in the chart. Or sometimes people will say, well, if a chart is quicker to visually process, that makes it better. And again, there are lots of data visualization studies that measure this, right? How quickly people will be able to read a given chart design compared to another. Or sometimes people will kind of argue for the opposite. If it's a chart that people kind of linger on, that to them indicates that it's better because it's, I guess, more engaging perhaps. Or especially in like data visualization competitions, for example, people will often say that a chart is better because it's more creative or perhaps more artistic or beautiful, or the data is presented in a more original way. And they'll say, well, that's a better chart. Others will kind of argue for the opposite. They'll say, oh, this chart is better than this other one because it's simpler or perhaps more familiar, i.e. it doesn't show the data in a creative or beautiful or kind of unusual way. Yet others will say, oh, this chart is better than this other chart because it's more versatile. It allows for a wider variety of insights to be sort of seen in the data, or a wider variety of questions to be answered about the data. Yet others will say that, no, a chart is better if it's more memorable. And actually, again, there are data visualization studies that will measure this, like how much information within a chart people are able to recall after the chart is concealed from their view. Yet others will say, no, one chart is better than another if it's more obvious, if the key insights, the key takeaways are very evident in the chart. Whereas others, again, will kind of argue the opposite, say, no, that's actually a bad chart. A good chart is objective, it's neutral. It leaves all interpretation of the data up to the audience. And yet others will argue that a chart is better if it evokes an emotional response, like perhaps curiosity or outrage or sympathy, for example. So unless we kind of get on the same page about what we mean by a better chart, well, we're probably not going to agree on very much. And so I actually have a bit of a different definition that I use when I'm trying to evaluate whether one chart is better than another, whether one design is better than another, right? And so the definition that I use of a good chart, which has served me well so far, is that a good chart does the job that it was created to do as quickly, comfortably, and safely as possible. So let's kind of break this down a little bit, right? What is the job of a chart? Well, basically that depends on the chart. And depending on the chart, its job could be to persuade the audience to do something, or to explain something to the audience, or get their attention, or answer a question that they've asked, or allow them to filter or look up values, and on and on and on. In fact, there are a virtually unlimited number of different types of jobs that charts can have. And so, like I said, the job is different from one chart to the next. So how we evaluate whether a chart is good or not is going to be different depending on the chart. And so I want to come back to this definition because there's sort of a second part to this, right? This quickly, comfortably, and safely part. So what exactly does that mean? Well, to my mind anyways, a good chart can be read quickly. It requires as little time as possible for the audience to interpret. Now, sometimes our chart is just showing something that's a little complex, and so as quick as possible might even be 30 or 60 seconds or even perhaps several minutes, but it's always as quick as possible. Comfortably simply means that it requires as little effort on the part of the audience to get what they need from the chart. They ideally are not being forced to perhaps learn a new chart type unnecessarily if there's a simpler one that could be available, for example. And then safely. This simply means that it poses the lowest risk possible of the audience misinterpreting the data in the chart. And this is actually really important because there are a lot of ways that charts accidentally misrepresent data, even when the chart creator was not trying to deceive anyone. In fact, each one of these thumbnails represents a unique way of accidentally misrepresenting the data, and yet is the kind of thing that you'll see all the time, unfortunately, in the wild. So if that's what I consider to be a good chart, what about these other kind of definitions, right? Do they matter? Yeah. I mean, it still matters, how precise a chart is or how quickly it can be visually processed or how memorable it is. But I call these subordinate qualities. These are qualities that a chart can have that increase its odds of doing its job, right? For example, if a chart is more obvious, it's also perhaps going to be more persuasive if persuasion is the ultimate job of the chart. These are not, however, what ultimately determine how good a chart is, in my opinion anyways, right? What ultimately determines how good a chart is, of course, does it do its job? So this might sound a little bit theoretical, but this does have, I think, pretty important implications in practice. For example, if we think of charts as graphics for doing a job, that's actually quite different than the way that most people think about charts, especially when they're designing charts, which is as visual representations of data. But if we consider that charts are graphics for doing a job, well, when we sit down to design a new chart, we're going to start with the question essentially of, do I know why I'm creating this, right? Am I trying to persuade the audience of something? Am I trying to explain something to them? Am I just trying to grab their attention, for example? Whereas if I think of a chart as a visual representation of data, usually the design process begins with, what's the best way to visualize this data? And I don't think that's actually a very helpful question to begin with, right? You want to start with the purpose of the chart, not necessarily the data. If we think of charts as graphics for doing a job, well, the main consideration in most of our design choices is going to be the specific job of the chart. So when we're choosing a chart type and a color palette and the how wide or narrow to make the scales and making many other design choices, really the job of the chart is going to be at the center of those design decisions. Whereas if we think of charts as visual representations of data, then the main consideration in most of our design choices is going to be the nature of the data, whether it's time series or the breakdown of a total or, distributions of values, for example. Now, obviously, when we're making design choices, we have to account for the nature of the data. But ultimately, in my experience, the nature of the data simply constrains our design choices, but there are always many possibilities that remain. And when we're choosing from amongst those remaining possibilities, it's really the specific job of the chart that's going to guide most of our decision making there. And again, if we think of charts as graphics for doing a job, well, when it comes to evaluating charts, if we're trying to compare two designs or decide if our chart is actually a good chart or not, we're basically going to ask ourselves, well, did it do the job that we created it to do? If it was a chart that was designed to explain something to the audience, did they understand what we are trying to explain to them? If it was a chart that was created to persuade the audience to take a given course of action, did they take that course of action? Ultimately, that's the gauge of how good the chart actually is, regardless of how precise it is or how memorable or how quickly it can be interpreted, for example. Whereas if we think of charts as visual representations of data, how are we going to evaluate that, right? Well, we're going to ask ourselves, does the chart visually represent the data? Well, yeah, I mean, all charts visually represent the data, even really bad ones. And so it takes a bit of a sort of a mental shift to kind of shift away from thinking of charts as visual representations of data and towards thinking of them as graphics for doing a job. And so, like I said in my last point here on the left, this is going to change the way in which we evaluate charts as well if we use this definition that I'm proposing for a good chart, right? For example, if I were to ask you, is this a good chart? Now, I know there's a whole bunch of you who are leaping out of your chairs right now, and I'm not going to get into the whole pie chart debate here. But in general, we can't answer that question without knowing what the chart is for. We don't know what the purpose of this chart is. However, if we were to assume that the purpose is to communicate that Mrs. Smith here contributed more than Mrs. Jones, well, I would say that this is a bad chart because it's hard to compare these slices, right? There's not enough precision essentially in this chart to see whether Mrs. Smith or Mrs. Jones had higher donations. They're too similar in size. However, if we assume that the job of this chart is to show that Mrs. Smith contributed almost a quarter of all donations, well, then I would say, yeah, this is probably a very good chart because it's very obvious that Mrs. Smith, that slice is a little less than a quarter. And maybe I would want to enhance it by highlighting that slice, for example. Or this one. Some of you may recognize this chart. It basically burned down DataViz Twitter last year. It was in the New York Times, showing essentially the case count in the States of COVID over the course of a little over 2 years. And a lot of people love this chart. A lot of people hated it. And when I look at a chart like this, again, or any other chart, I'm going to be asking myself, well, what is it for, right? What is the job of the chart? If the job of this chart were to precisely show case count trends over time, well, this is a bad chart, right? Because it's kind of hard to see it. It would be much easier if we unwrap the spiral and basically turned it into a standard line chart, right? However, if we assume that the job of this chart is to increase the odds that a reader will read the article, which was below it, well, this is probably a really good chart. It grabs your attention, it kind of draws you in. And so again, depending on what the job of the chart actually is, that's going to really ultimately determine how good or bad it is, right? We have to kind of know what the chart is for before we're going to start evaluating different chart designs. By the way, this talk is actually extracted from the introductory part of a course that I deliver called Practical Charts. And I mostly deliver this in private workshops, but I do a couple of public ones a year. And so if you're interested in this kind of thinking, there's one coming up next month in June. And I've created a little discount code. You can get 15% off if you're attending the conference here at Outlier. Thanks very much. This talk was pre-recorded, but I am planning on attending the Q&A session live. And so I believe I will be available right after this to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks very much for listening.